For the past few years, Formula E has raced around the city of London, with the event taking place on the road surrounding the Excel Centre right next to the River Thames, with the circuit even going indoors like an indoor-outdoor go-kart track. The circuit is the only street track in the UK, with it hosting Formula E once a year every July, although whether it will continue to do that after 2026 remains up in the air, especially with rumours surrounding the race being replaced by Silverstone. It isn't the first time London has hosted a street race, with Battersea Park hosting races for Formula E in the first 2 years of the series' existence, before they were forced to stop racing there after 2016, and also Crystal Palace hosting various motorsport events between 1953 and 1972, including a non-championship round for Formula 1, with the circuit using various footpaths from the Crystal Palace Park. But what you may be interested to know is the fact that London wasn't the only city to host street racing in the UK, with the second biggest city in the country also dipping their hand at street racing, which, although it only lasted for 5 years, still left a mark in UK motorsport folklore. This is the story of the UK street track known as the Birmingham Superprix. The story of the Birmingham Superprix actually goes all the way back to 1966, where two men by the names of Peter Barwell and Martin Hone proposed the idea of a street track to Birmingham City Council. Peter, who himself was a councillor, had the idea in his head 5 years prior after attending the 24 Hours Le Mans, and was inspired to try and bring motorsport to his home city, whilst Martin, who was a businessman and a music club owner and often dabbled in sports car racing, was also keen on having a race in Birmingham. And with the council looking for a way to boost the city's reputation, he felt the best way to achieve this would be to have a street circuit in the city, given that at the time Birmingham was famous for manufacturing cars. This proposal would end up being rejected, as it was initially seen as impossible to do due to the amount of money that would have been needed to organise such a big event, along with the fact that back in 1960 the government had banned any form of motorsport taking place on public highways. This, as you can imagine, was seen as a defeat, with seemingly no chance of the project getting off the ground. But despite this, Hone was not deterred, and decided that giving up was not the best solution. Instead, he set about gathering support from as many people as he could, but with councillors still rejecting the proposal, he instead called upon some help from many names in motorsport, including Sir Stirling Moss, Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart. Then, in 1970, after a few years of persistence, a breakthrough would occur thanks to a bit of luck that would fall into Hone's lap. During that year, a councillor by the name of John Silk, who at the time was the chair of Birmingham's Entertainment Subcommittee, had a plan to hold a festival in the city during the summer, but what that festival would entail, he wasn't quite sure yet. This presented an opportunity for Hone, who, after seeing this idea, proposed to John a motoring pageant as a way to celebrate the city's motoring industry, which, to the delight of Hone, he accepted. The festival would last for 14 days, with it consisting of demonstration runs around a 2-mile ring road course with all types of different cars, including a run from Stirling Moss in a Lotus 18 driven at only 30 miles per hour in order to avoid breaking the speed limit that was still being enforced. The event would be seen as a huge success, with even the Lord Mayor of Birmingham City Council at the time, Neville Bosworth, being a massive fan of the event. This naturally would get the juices flowing again for Hone and Barwell to propose an actual race again around the city, but once again the council were not very keen. Years would go by, with more car festivals taking place during that time, but still no progress surrounding a street track being built. But eventually, as a result of each festival gaining more momentum in popularity, the council were eventually persuaded to try and present a new road racing legislation to the government, which initially they would throw out. But after a lot of persuading and negotiating, the bill would finally get passed through in November 1984, but with a compromise that was set out by people who were against it. The compromise, which was known as a sunset clause, being that the event could only be held during a bank holiday weekend in August and it could only be a 2-day event. On top of this, the clause also stated that the event would only have 5 years starting in 1986 to prove it could make a profit. Failure to do so, and the event would not be renewed after 1990, so no pressure then. But even with this clause, and even with the number of setbacks along the way, Hone and Barwell finally made their dream a reality. But unfortunately for Hone, he wouldn't be able to oversee the project in full swing. Despite pouring his heart and soul into bringing the project to life, Hone was told by Birmingham City Council that he would not be the promoter of the street circuit, which had now been christened the Birmingham Superprix. Instead, he was forced to sit on the sidelines while someone else promoted it instead, a bit like how Rockingham first opened a decade and a half later, which you can check out in the card on the top right, as I have made a video about that circuit as well. The job of promoter was instead given to a man named Andrew Marrier, who ran a sports marketing company known as CSS and was also very well known in the motorsport circle. He would stage the first ever Superprix on the 25th to 26th of August 1986, and it would host 2 Motorsport Series. One of them being a round of the Thundersports Series, which consisted of prototype sports cars, Can-Am cars and Group C2 cars, and the other one, which would be the main attraction, would be a round of the Formula 1 feeder series, known as Formula 3000, which back in the 1980s was the equivalent of Formula 2. The circuit itself was very interesting to say the least, with the track being anti-clockwise in its design, with some of the roads being used being in the opposite direction to what the public used, in order to mitigate the chance of anyone trying to drive around the circuit when the barriers were removed. The pit lane was also very unique to say the least, with it being located on the forecourt of a Ford dealership owned by Bristol Street Motors, with the garages for all the teams being located in a multi-storey car park around the back. The first corner, known as Labatt's Corner, would be a 90-degree left-hander, which would take the drivers past a block of flats before making their way towards a roundabout which would act as a bus stop chicane. A long straight would follow, before they made their way towards another roundabout, which would be straightened out to make it like a hairpin style corner. A quick right-hander would follow straight away, before another long straight past an actual bus stop would take the drivers towards the double right-hander of Ferodo Corner. Another long straight would follow, before arriving at the quick left-hander of Diner Glaze, before it narrowed up at the exit of the 90-degree Cavendish Finance Corner. A short blast on the accelerator before the drivers made their way to the final chicane known as Honda to complete the lap. Whilst the layout on paper looked a bit boring, the number of challenges each corner had, combined with the elevation of the 2 long back straights, made it a very unique challenge. But even despite this, the first Superprix didn't get off to the best of starts, as before any sessions could get underway, there was a delay of 2.5 hours due to reports that circulated that some of the bolts that were holding the barriers in place had been stolen by some of the locals, made worse by the fact that some of the barriers were installed incorrectly. Once those issues had been sorted, the first session of the Birmingham Superprix would finally get underway, with the rest of the day going without a hitch. But the next day would see the circuit being hit with torrential rain, as a direct cause of Hurricane Charlie, which hit the West Midlands quite hard. This would lead to more delays, but just like the previous day, the action would eventually get going, albeit in wet conditions. And it would be these conditions that would end up causing chaos in the Formula 3000 race, with cars aquaplaning left, right and centre, with it even catching out the leaders. This would eventually lead to the race being abandoned after 24 of the 51 laps were completed, with Louis Perez Sala being declared the winner and picking up half points, despite his car having the notable absence of a nose cone. Overall, not a very good first ever meeting, but with attendance figures being very good, there was still optimism for the circuit in the years to come. The second year would only have Formula 3000 on the bill, but unlike the previous year, the event would thankfully run smoothly without a hitch, with bright blue skies overlooking the Birmingham skyline, even if there wasn't much of a skyline to look at. 1988 would see the event host two Motorsport Series again, with the Formula 3000 Championship being joined by the UK's biggest national championship, the British Touring Car Championship, during a time when the series still had the confusing group system. Unfortunately, the BTCC race would end up getting cancelled due to events that would transpire in the Formula 3000 race that would end up pushing back proceedings. On the first lap of the race, David Hunt, younger brother of 1976 world champion James Hunt, would have a huge crash at the fast Dinah Glaze corner when his car would launch itself on the outside gravel trap and into a brick wall behind the tyre barriers, splitting his car in half in the process. Thankfully, David would survive the accident, but would sustain a concussion as a result of the impact, with him up until his sad death in 2015 having no recollection of the accident. The race would have another red flag when a pileup would occur at the Cavendish Finance corner, which would end up delaying proceedings even further, to the point where the BTCC race was forced to be cancelled, with the series having to wait another year before they could finally race around the circuit. The next two meetings in 1989 and 1990 would go without a hitch, but unfortunately for the promoters, the on-track action would not be enough to renew the circuit's contract for 1991, as a rise in organisational costs combined with the depleting number of attendance figures would see the event being cancelled after 1990, with plans for an extension to the circuit being ultimately scrapped. After only 5 years of the event being ran, the Birmingham Superprix was already over, a sad way for such an exciting chapter of British motorsport to come to an end, with the UK's version of Monaco having a special place in a lot of people's hearts. For someone who wasn't born when the Birmingham Superprix was a thing, I missed out on an exciting period of the British motorsport calendar, as it's safe to say for a brief time, the event matched the same sort of hype as the British Grand Prix for Formula 1. Attempts have been made to try and revive the circuit in some capacity, with even Formula E at one point being rumoured to revive some of the circuit for a Formula E race after the London E-Prix at Battersea Park was cancelled. Sadly, this never came to fruition, with Formula E eventually returning to London, this time at the Excel Centre instead of Battersea Park. Remnants of the circuit still remain to this day, with some of the yellow flowers that made up the words Birmingham Superprix still present, whilst the bit of tarmac that made up the Halfords hairpin at the massive roundabout still remain as well, even if it has been barriered off to stop people from driving their vehicles on it. Since its closure in 1990, Birmingham hasn't hosted a motorsport event, which for me is a really sad sight, as had the race made its debut in the present day, I think it would have been welcomed with open arms by many motorsport fans. Granted, it would need upgrades to get it up to modern safety standards, but the point remains the same regardless. The Birmingham Superprix, a short but memorable moment in UK motorsport.